Hey everyone, in this video lecture we are covering the topic of natural selection. And so natural selection is really this idea that Charles Darwin came up with about evolution and how it occurs after Darwin spent years traveling the world, making observations about plants and animals, and he came up with this idea saying that individuals that have traits that make them better suited to their environment, they're going to survive, they're going to reproduce, passing down those traits to their offspring. So over time, species are going to gradually change based on the traits that are best suited to that environment. And this is really this idea of survival of the fittest. So for example, if we have an environment that is mostly dark colored, so we have this dark rock surface, and we have mice that have different versions of the trait for fur color, there are some mice with dark fur and mice with light fur. In this environment, the dark mice are better suited because they can blend in and camouflage with that environment. And the predator, in this case of the hawk, is more likely to eat the mice that are light colored. So it's an advantage to be dark, a disadvantage to be light. So what's going to happen is the dark ones are going to have a better chance to survive. That means they're going to reproduce, and the offspring of the next generation are going to be more of the dark colored mice compared to the light colored mice. And so over time, we see the species gradually becoming darker and darker, and we see less and less of the light mice because the dark mice are more fit to survive, whereas the light mice are not. Now, in order to have natural selection occur, in order for this survival of the fittest to play out, we need some things in that particular population of organisms. The first thing we need is some variation. If all the traits are identical, there's not going to be some trait that gives you an advantage. So we need different versions of the same trait in the same species. So in that example there was mice that have different versions of the trait for fur color. There were light mice and dark mice. There needs to be inheritance of the trait. So that means the trait must be able to be passed down to offspring. It can't be some trait. For example, in humans, if I am a brunette, I have brown hair, but I dye my hair blonde, that is not a trait that I will pass down to my offspring. It is something that I've done after the fact that has nothing to do with my DNA. So in order for that trait to be a part of natural selection, we need to make sure it is inherited. It's part of the DNA. There needs to be differential success. And what we mean by that, so you have different versions of the same trait. Some individuals with one version of the trait are going to be more likely more likely survive and then pass down that trait to the offspring compared to those without the trait. Okay, so if there's two versions of the trait for mouse fur color, the dark mice have better success and are more likely to survive than those without the dark fur trait. And lastly here is adaptation, which means the frequency of this trait that's giving you an advantage is going to increase over time. So if that trait is helping individuals survive and reproduce, we should see it more often. So if you have these four factors, then natural selection is occurring. And here's a really good example of this out in nature where we see natural selection. So the peppered moth was a common moth in England, or is a common moth. I think it's still around. And there's variation in the wing pattern coloring. So what we would call the normal moth has kind of like a black and white peppered look to it. And then there is a mutant version of the moth where the wing coloring is all black. Okay, so we have variation between the trait for the moth wing colors. Now, if we look at this picture here, how many moths can you see in the picture? So there should be an obvious moth here that is dark colored. But then there might be there is another moth that is harder for you to probably see. That is that peppered variant, right? The wing colors look black and white speckled. Now, we think about these two moths in the picture. Which one is more likely to survive? Well, obviously the black and white peppery colored one is more likely to survive just because it's harder to see. If you're a predator and you're looking really quickly, it's going to be a lot easier to spot the dark colored moth on this birch tree compared to the peppered moth, the true colored peppered moth. Okay. Now this is important because this means the moth is going to have differential success. The peppered colored moth is going to be more likely to survive, whereas the dark colored moth is less likely to survive. Now, what happened though, which was really interesting, is that in England in the 1800s, there was a lot of factories, and those factories were emitting lots of pollution. And what happened was the pollution, the smoke coming out of the factories had a lot of soot in it. So those light covered birch trees got covered in the soot. So again, we had variation in the color of the moths, but now their environment has changed. So originally the trees that they lived on were light colored, but now the trees they live on are dark colored. So this leads us to think, now that the environment has changed, which of the two moths is going to have the advantage? So originally the light white peppery colored moth had the advantage, but now the dark colored moth has the advantage. And so this is going to lead to evolution in these moths. So before the Industrial Revolution and all the factories and pollution, it was more common for this type of moth to be the light colored moth. It was less likely to see the dark colored moth variant, that mutant. But because of that pollution in their environment, what we saw was over time, the dark colored moth became more popular and the light colored moth became less popular, almost non-existent, very small population of them. This represents evolution. Okay, we have different versions of the trait for wing color. We see that the dark colored wing color has the advantage here. They're more likely to survive and reproduce. They're passing down that trait that is giving them the advantage to their offspring. So over time, we see the frequency of the mutant colored trait more frequent in the population. So we know that these peppered moths have experienced natural selection, or that survival of the fittest. Then lastly here, when it comes to natural selection, there are 3 types of natural selection. And so when it comes to traits typically exhibit what we call a bell curve distribution, meaning if I have a population of mice, or I'm looking at one single species of mice, and we're looking at the trait for fur color, there's usually kind of fur colors on either end of the extreme. So the really dark colored mouse and the really light colored mouse, we might not see that extreme trait very often. There might be only 1 or 2 mice in the entire species with the really dark and really light fur color. Most of the mice in the species are going to fall in the middle range of color. So we see more mice that are in that medium color range. And this is typical of traits, right? There's a spectrum of variation. Either end is kind of the extremes. We don't see a lot of individuals with those extreme traits. The majority fall in that middle area. Well, what can happen is, depending on the type of natural selection that's occurring, we might see a change in that distribution, or the amount of mice in this case with each of the fur colors. So again, originally it was very rare to be a really dark mouse or a really light mouse. But let's say natural selection favors that mid-range color, that light brown color. So the really dark mouse is selected against. Natural selection, that's a disadvantage. Similarly, the light colored mouse is a disadvantage. So what happens is, in this type of natural selection, either extreme is wiped out. They have a disadvantage, that trait will not be passed down. Whereas the middle trait is optimal. That is giving this population the best chance of survival. So we're going to see it more frequently over time. So we call that stabilizing selection. And this is what kind of keeps certain traits very similar to one another, and we get rid of those extreme ends of the trait. Now, directional selection is like what we saw with the peppered moths, where you're going from one extreme to the other. So in the case of the mouse the mouse population here with the different fur colors, the really dark mouse is favored in the instance that I showed you at the very beginning where they lived on a really dark surface. Similarly to the peppered moth, the really dark moth was now favored when those trees were dark and soot colored. Whereas, so see here, the dark moth blends really well into that dark tree, so it becomes favored. Whereas the light moth, or in this case, the light colored mouse, is no longer an advantage. So those individuals are not surviving, not reproducing. So over time, what's going to happen is the majority of the mice we're going to see become darker in color. So again, that is where we see the natural selection in a trait really changing from, in the peppered moths, light to dark. And then, so that's called directional selection, where the selection is favored in one direction of the trait over the other. And then lastly, disruptive selection. This is a really important type of natural selection because each of the extremes here, so the dark mouse and the really light mouse, they're favored. In this case, for whatever reason, that is the advantage, where the middle color is not an advantage. So that middle color, we're going to see less and less mice with it, and we're going to see more and more mice with the light and with the dark. And so over time, this disruptive selection, where it favors either end of the trait spectrum, this is where we could see species forming. Eventually, the light-colored mice and the dark-colored mice could become separate species because, again, that middle color is no longer favored. Okay, so there's more to becoming their own species, but this is, the starting point for speciation to occur.